So, depending on where you are in the Buddhist world, which involves 1.5 billion-ish, bless you people, this full moon is observed either as Asalha Puja or Dharma Day, Dhamma Day, depending on language and tradition. But it's the day that commemorates, or the full moon night that commemorates the first time the historical Buddha taught. You'll remember that after the Buddha's kind of awakening experience, he spent some time, traditionally it's said 49 days, trying to figure out what in the hell he was going to say, or if he should say anything at all. He probably could have had a very nice job, as a woodcutter or something, and just been a fully enlightened, pot maker or something, and that would have been totally fine. Luckily for us, he decided to say something. And he spent those 49 days. You can imagine how difficult it is trying to translate raw experience into words, especially an experience that is so deeply counterintuitive to the habitual, compulsive ways that, I'll speak for myself, I live my life. The Dharma is, in one sense, deeply intuitive. It's easy to hear it and be like, yeah, that makes sense. Even if you're like 9 years old and you're watching Kung Fu on Channel 5, and you hear something on there and you're like, that makes a lot of sense. Or, you catch a snippet of Thich Nhat Hanh on somebody's Instagram page or something, you're like, ooh, that's a banger. I get that. I feel that. But in some ways, it's profoundly counterintuitive. And that was one of the Buddha's big kind of concerns, is what I want to tell people is kind of the opposite of what they think the world is like. It's against the stream. But he eventually decides he's going to teach. And so the question is like, well, who am I going to tell it to? So according to the traditional accounts, he walks to the deer park at Isipatana, also called Sarnath. This is like 5 miles, 10 miles north of Varanasi, Benares in India, northern India. And a deer park is, there was also, in this time in India, there were squirrel parks and deer parks and bird parks, places where you couldn't, it was like a nature reserve. You could not mess with the wildlife there. And the deer at this park were like, the park was lousy with deer. These beautiful, you can imagine just a park full of like does and bucks, and beautiful place, natural place. And so the Buddha goes back to Sarnath, and he finds these 5 seekers with whom he had spent years training, practicing in a certain way with a certain orientation. One might call it a very heroic way of practicing. And this tradition is still present within the yoga traditions of India. People that they call Naga Babas or sadhus or even agoris. These are people who have determined that their problem, their big block to attaining oneness, to remembering their true identity as that open, boundless spirit behind everything. The problem, they've identified the problem, and the problem is me. And they're like, well, how do I fix that? I know. I'm going to starve myself. I'm going to deny myself everything I want. I'm going to eat, a handful of rice. And I can't keep any, I can't store any food. So if nobody gives me any food, I'll just fast that day. They give up sleep for long periods of time. They meditate for hours and hours a day. They practice this really profound, rigorous discipline. Lots of, yoga to kind of subdue the body and make it shut up so you can sit long hours and just, it's a really, in its way, it's beautiful. And that's how the Buddha practiced for years with these 5 fellow seekers, his 5 companions. And he eventually parted ways with them and found his own way. This teaching is recorded in a couple different places, and it very much sets the kind of template for how the Buddha would teach for the next 45 to 49 years of his life. But it tickles me to no end. I should learn the name of this concept, but there's a concept, there's an idea within textual criticism or study of religious texts where you can imagine if somebody's writing a story about the Buddha, they're probably a Buddhist and they're probably a big fanboy like me. And so of course it's going to be like, oh my God, he was so great. And he never pooped and he was a wonderful person. He never got mad and he wasn't a jerk. But it's interesting because the suttas are full of the Buddha doing very human stuff, complaining about his aching back, complaining about knuckleheaded students like me, all this kind of really normal stuff. So the idea within the kind of tradition of religious text criticism is that if there's a story or a concept that paints the religious figure at the center of it in a slightly negative light, it's probably accurate. So there's this interesting little section here where the Buddha finds his 5 ex-buddies. And he's like, hey! And they literally are like, who's this guy? And they're like, if he comes, don't talk to him. Don't look at him. Don't offer him a seat. Because they can see coming from a long way. He's been eating. He's wearing fresh cloth. It looks like he combed his hair. This guy has absolutely turned his back on the spiritual quest. This guy is a bogi in Sanskrit. That means enjoyer. He's a vantasi, which is like a yogic curse word. It means a vomit eater. Somebody who previously had vomited out the world and the ways of the world and then went back. He's like a backslider, to put it in a Christian context. And they're like, we're not going to talk to him. And he walks right up to him, hey, my friends. And luckily for us, there was something about his vibe, something about and it's kind of how it is in the text. They're like, huh. You can tell when someone's profoundly troubled and working on something, chewing on something, wounded. And you can tell when someone has something has clicked. You see someone you haven't seen in a while, and you're like, hey, you look great. What happened? And you try to not take that as an insult. And you're like, yeah, I feel great, thanks. It's like, what happened? And so he's like, hey, I want to talk to you about what I discovered. And they, luckily for us, are like, okay, hit me, what you got? And it's interesting because he starts off with very specific teachings geared towards them. And this is something that very much sets the mold for the Buddha's teachings. There's a lot of places, religious figures of old were supposedly miraculous and they had superpowers and they could, fly around the world and do all kinds of magical stuff because, you get enlightened, that's what it means, right? Otherwise, who cares? And the Buddha would say things like, oh, I don't have those, but I have a superpower. I can teach anyone. I can reach anyone. I know exactly where they are, which oddly enough is the same superpower that a really good con man has. But the Buddha was said that, he's like, no, this I can do. I can talk to someone and I can see, so maybe the best therapist ever. It's like, I got it. So the first thing out of his mouth is, hey, this whole thing you're doing of trying to basically destroy the body, trying to destroy your humanity to get to the divine, which is a pretty common model if you think about it. The spiritual bypass is a term that has gotten popular lately, and I'm a big fan of it, but if you've never, you would be in the minority of humans if you've never discovered a belief system or an exercise regimen or a diet regimen, and you're like, that's going to change me. That's going to fix it. That's the missing ingredient. And maybe it's just me, but I've done that 100,000 times. I've even seen Oh, I hope my mom's not online. I saw my mom do it a couple 100,000 times. There was always this supplement or that vitamin or this thing that was going to fix it. Luckily for me and my mom, that also included getting me into meditation at a young age. But I still do that knuckleheaded stuff. I still try to think of, there's got to be some way that I can talk to my sons and they're just going to get it all figured out and make all the right choices and their life will be great forever. Spoiler alert. So the first thing he talks about is like, he talks about this middle way. He says, torturing the body, punishing the body is ignoble. It's fruitless. It's painful. It only causes consternation, and it does not bear spiritual fruit. Similarly, mindless hedonism, mindless self-indulgence, this kind of reinforcing and wallowing in our kind of habitual compulsive ways that we numb out or try to pour pleasure on top of our pain doesn't work either. These are two extremes. And he says, the Tathagata, me, this one, has found the truth of the middle way, avoiding all extremes. And he goes on to teach about the Four Noble Truths, etc., etc., etc. So this is the night traditionally when people in the Buddhist world, in the kind of heritage Buddhist world, will go to temple, will maybe, meditate, if at all, or meditate a lot more, or make charitable gifts. It's a way to kind of orient the calendar. And I think that can be really valuable in terms of like thinking about how we orient our lives, the wheel of our year. Maybe it's around school, or, I was complaining earlier about my 6-day weeks at work. And that's how my life is kind of oriented. When do I get to hang out with my wife and kids? When do I get to do this or that? And that's the wheel of my year. That's the axle, the center point. But I think it can be really valuable. This is one of the great treasures of traditional religious practice, including Buddhism, that you can actually start to be like, hey, there's a full moon in July, and that's the night when the Buddha first taught. And the common way it's said is, he set the wheel of Dharma in motion. And it has rolled for 2,600 years, and we are here today because of that. So for myself, in addition to working and taking a nap and whatever else I did and will do, it's for me personally valuable to reflect on the sheer fact that a person, a normal human being with his own neuroses and avoidance and trauma 2,600 years ago found a way into his own precious heart and taught that way, and it was continued and continued for 80 generations till the present day. All over the world, through various languages, systems of belief, etc., etc. And in the end, no system of belief, no religion is big enough to completely house the human heart. Just because I consider myself a card-carrying Buddhist, truth isn't Buddhist. Breathing isn't Buddhist. Love isn't Buddhist. The only things that are valuable in this world of beliefs and ideas and tenet systems and etc., are things that can help us to enter into and abide in the truth of our own precious heart.